Tonight we have Heather McDonald. She is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. She's a contributing editor of City Journal, and she's published very widely in popular media, such as the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, the New Republic, a long list of important venues in which she's published. We're very fortunate to have her here tonight. Her new book, well, the title of it really tells you what you need to know about the sorts of things she'll be talking about. Her book is entitled The Diversity Delusion: How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupts the University and Undermines Our Culture. So, Heather McDonald.
Thank you so much, Professor Pasnow. This is an extraordinary privilege to be the guest of the Center for Western Civilization, an enterprise that is absolutely at the core of, should be at the core of every university, and is certainly the center of my heart. Thank you for making my visit so enjoyable. Thank you, Ms. Holgram, for giving me the opportunity to visit Boulder and this gorgeous, gorgeous campus. And thank you for coming tonight on a blustery evening, but not too cold, so I appreciate it. I'm going to state some core principles initially. Every student enrolled in this university is among the most privileged human beings in history. And I use the term privileged in a positive sense. Why? Because that student has at his fingertips the thing that Faust sold his soul for: knowledge. To be sure, some Boulder students come from more prosperous backgrounds than others. It doesn't matter. Once you are here, everything is available to you on an equal basis. You're surrounded by libraries that would have driven the Renaissance humanists mad with envy and desire. You can read every book that has ever been written. You have access to scientific laboratories that are the most advanced in the world, and they are all open to you. You can pursue languages, literature, and history at will. And here at Boulder, your spirits can be uplifted by breathtaking geology and noble architecture. And yet, students across the country are taught to think of themselves as victims and to see bigotry where none exists. Now, where are these students getting these views? From a pervasive ideology that has taken over university bureaucracies and much of the disciplines. That ideology holds that the most important thing about a person is his gonads and melanin, and the discrimination based on those characteristics is the defining feature of American colleges and American society in general. Students routinely announce their victimhood before an appreciative audience of diversity deanlets and vice provosts who use the occasion to expand their bureaucratic domain. Any student, however, who thinks of himself as oppressed on a college campus is in the grips of a terrible delusion that will encumber him for the rest of his life. The reality is this: there has never been an environment more tolerant towards history's traditionally marginalized groups than an American campus. Traits that can still lead to death and warfare in other countries are actively celebrated in academia. The University of Colorado Boulder, for example, like colleges everywhere, is filled with liberal, well-meaning faculty who want all of their students to succeed. They are not bigots. They are paragons of goodwill. Every faculty hiring search is one concerted effort to find minority and female candidates who have not already been snapped up by better endowed schools. So fervently do campus administrators across the country desire the presence of so-called students of color that they routinely employ racial preferences in admissions. Yet rather than remind students of these truths, administrators and many professors encourage students to see everything through the lens of oppression and identity politics. Freshman orientations regularly include indoctrination sessions in white privilege, where students are taught their place on the ruthlessly competitive totem pole of victimhood. You're either in a highly sought-after oppressed class or in the oppressor class. If you're assigned the oppressor role, you can only escape that benighted status by becoming an ally. Well, allies are something we usually associate with war. And indeed, the thinking on college campuses today is that females and minority students are at risk of their lives from circumambient racism and sexism. At Brown, students occupied the president's office to complain about such ordinary academic expectations as going to class and studying for their exams because they said they were so focused on, quote, staying alive at Brown. At Yale, a mob of students surrounded a highly respected sociologist and cursed and screamed at him for 3 hours because his wife had sent an email suggesting that students can choose their own Halloween costumes free from the tender ministrations of Yale's discrimination police. Among the shouts of, "Shut the F up," and they didn't condense the word, and "You are disgusting," that were directed at this mild-mannered left-wing professor was a cry of, "We're dying," from one of the ranters, referring to the alleged endangered status of Yale's minority students. Boulder's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Community Engagement, which boasts a vice chancellor, 2 assistant vice chancellors, and an associate vice chancellor, among other staff, produced a diversity plan in November 2018. The plan was indistinguishable from the thousands like it generated by other campus bureaucracies on a routine basis. It claimed that Boulder contains, quote, discrimination and bias. It reported with seeming credulity that various groups feel, quote, threatened on our campus. The solution, it said, was to hire, quote, equity-minded practitioners who were experienced in issues of equity and inclusion and who could help move Boulder towards a more equitable pedagogy. I'm going to propose something radical here. Boulder's professors and administrators are committed to treating all their students fairly. No one is discriminating against or threatening anyone. At this very moment, foreign students across the world are studying night and day in the hope of winning the privilege of attending this allegedly discriminatory university and others like it. These foreign students believe that once here, boundless, life-changing opportunity surrounds them, so long as they put in the effort to learn. Are they wrong? Would they be better off staying in their home countries? Course catalogs the country over are brimming with courses based on students' allegedly oppressed identity, narrowly defined by race, sexual orientation, and gender preference. This self-regard results in obsessive attention to an ever-growing set of minutiae that trap the unwary into committing imaginary sins. The following passage is from an article on the use of she, her pronouns by cisgender gay men, and it's emblematic. Quote, Alex, who identifies as a non-binary trans femme, sometimes feels uncomfortable with cis men using she, her towards them, i.e. Alex. Quote, with girl, she, her, they, i.e. Alex, say, if I'm socializing with cis gay men, and that's what they're using to describe each other and to describe me, there's a little bit of dissonance there because I'm not really sure if they're using that to validate my gender or if it's being used as it's used with other cis gay men. This discourse is, if nothing else, an educational dead end. The purpose of education is to take students out of their narrow, petty selves into worlds vastly larger than their own. Contrast Alex's navel-gazing with the West's humanist tradition. which was founded on the all-consuming desire to engage with real difference, the radical difference of the past. The 14th century Florentine poet Francesco Petrarch triggered the explosion of knowledge known today as Renaissance humanism with his discovery of Livy's monumental history of Rome and the letters of Cicero. But Petrarch didn't want to just read the ancients. He wanted to converse with them as well. And so he penned heartfelt letters in Latin to Virgil, Seneca, Horace, and Homer, among others, informing them of the fate of their writings and of Rome itself. After rebuking Cicero for the vindictiveness revealed in his letters, Petrarch repented and wrote him again, quote, "I fear that my last letter has offended you, but I feel I know you as intimately as if I had always lived with you." The burning drive to recover a lost culture propelled the Renaissance humanists into remote castles and monasteries across Europe to search for long-forgotten manuscripts. The knowledge that many ancient texts were forever lost filled these scholars with despair. Nevertheless, they exulted in their growing repossession of classical learning, for which they felt, in Ralph Waldo Emerson's words, a canine appetite. In François Rabelais' exuberant Gargantua stories from the 1530s, the giant Gargantua sends off his son to study in Paris, joyfully conjuring up the languages, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Chaldean, and Arabic, that he expects him to master, as well as the vast range of history, law, natural history, and philosophy. In short, he concludes, "Let me find you a perfect abyss of knowledge." Instead of this wild enthusiasm, listen to a Columbia University undergraduate grousing about Columbia's increasingly beleaguered core curriculum. Quote, "Who is this Mozart, this Haydn, these superior white men? The core," she said, quote, "upholds the premises of white supremacy and racism. Few professors have defended our intellectual patrimony against such shameful outbreaks of ecstatic know-nothingism without adding some puling qualification about respect for diversity. W.E.B. Du Bois would have been stunned by the blinders of identity politics. Living during America's darkest period of hate, Du Bois nevertheless heartbreakingly affirmed his affinity with all of Western civilization. Quote, "I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. Across the color line, I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas. I summon Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul I will, and they come all graciously with no scorn nor condescension." Frederick Douglass likewise abjured a color test for his reading. At age 12, he discovered a collection of speeches by 18th century British orators. "Every opportunity afforded me," Douglass wrote in his autobiography, "was spent in diligently perusing the collection, which Douglass called a, quote, rich treasure, which gave tongue to thoughts which had frequently flashed through my soul and died away for want of utterance." Ralph Ellison read Marx, Freud, T.S. Eliot, Pound, Gertrude Stein, and Hemingway as a young man in Mason County, Alabama. Books, he said, which, quote, seldom, if ever, mentioned Negroes, but which were to release him from, quote, whatever segregated idea I might have had of my human possibilities. It requires real poverty of imagination, Ellison concluded, to think that self-understanding, quote, can come to a Negro only through the example of other Negroes. Were Du Bois, Douglass, and Ellison deluded? If you believe the undergraduates from colleges across the country who have complained about having to read the Western canon, the answer is yes. That is a remarkable judgment to make. Teaching students to view their inheritance through the trivializing lens of race, gender, and oppression is educational malpractice, and it is changing the fabric of our world. The drive to shut down ideas that challenge academic orthodoxies grows out of the preposterous conceit that students are at risk of their lives on college campuses. This censorious drive would also have perplexed our greatest civil rights crusaders, who actually did face lethal hatred. In 1860, a pro-slavery mob broke up an abolitionist meeting in Boston held to commemorate the death of anti-slavery crusader John Brown. In response, Frederick Douglass penned a pamphlet entitled "A Plea for Free Speech in Boston." "Slavery cannot tolerate free speech," he wrote. 5 years of its exercise would banish the auction block and break every chain in the South. Douglass understood that freedom of expression, quote, "is the dread of tyrants. It is the right which they first of all strike down," end quote, because it challenges authority. Martin Luther King Jr., speaking in Memphis the day before he was murdered, called for the country to honor, quote, "basic First Amendment privileges," understanding with Douglass that those privileges protect minorities against majority power. The campus censors now hold the reins of power to define prescribable hate speech, but do they really want to create a precedent and give that power to Donald Trump? Finally, campus identity politics have entered the STEM fields, the science, technology, engineering, and math, which are under enormous pressure to hire by gender and race. STEM administrators now treat gender and race as scientific qualifications. In faculty hiring searches across the country, the most qualified candidates in physics, astronomy, chemistry, and math are being sidelined in favor of so-called diverse applicants, regardless of those applicants' research record. Nationally, diversity deans are tearing up short lists for science hiring and demanded that those lists be reconfigured to contain, above all, more females. But being female is not an accomplishment, it's not a particularly interesting trait, and it is certainly not one relevant to scientific achievement. Yet females in the hard sciences are now being preferred over their male colleagues, hired earlier in their careers and with a thinner record of citations. When an Italian physicist at CERN, the European Consortium for Atomic Physics, pointed this out at a conference last year, he was summarily fired. His fate was adumbrated by Google's firing of computer engineer James Damore in August 2017. Damore's sin was to have penned a fact-based memo suggesting that the average career predilections of males and females, average, not individual, we're talking about distributions, help explain why there is not 50-50 gender parity at Google and other big tech firms. Google's CEO echoed the language of academic victimology in firing Damore. Damore's memo, he said, had made Google's female workers feel, quote, unsafe, and thus Damore had to go. When it comes to science, China is ruthlessly meritocratic and doesn't give a damn about the so-called diversity of its labs. We're putting our scientific edge at risk by introducing the irrelevancies of identity politics into scientific research. We have bestowed on the faculty the greatest job in the world. Freed from the pressures of economic competition, they are actually paid to spend their days wandering among the most sublime creations of mankind. All we ask of them in return is that they sell their wares to ignorant undergraduates, as I was and still am, ignorant that is, not an undergraduate. I wish I still was. I would make up for lost time, believe me. There's a lot of things I didn't study that I should have. Every fall, insistent voices should rise from the academic department saying, here is greatness, and this is your best opportunity to absorb it. Here is Aeschylus, whose terrible choruses bear witness to chthonic forces more unsettling than you can yet fathom. Here is Mark Twain, Habsburg Vienna, the St. Matthew Passion. Here is the drama of Western civilization, out of whose constantly battling ideas evolved unprecedented individual freedom and unimagined scientific progress. We must never blind ourselves to the grotesque violation of America's founding ideals, that was slavery and de jure and de facto segregation, a violation that made a mockery of America's alleged commitment to equality. At this point, however, there is no risk of underestimating the enormity of America's past cruelty, violence, and barbarism. It is front and center across much of the humanities and social sciences. But it is a tragic waste of opportunity to read the past only through the lens of oppression, rather than opening yourself up to the beauty, wit, and profundity of a vast and rich tradition. There were sickening, contemptible flaws in our past, as in every civilization, but they are greatly outnumbered by astounding accomplishments. Ignorance of the intellectual trajectory that led to the rule of law, and the West's unimaginable prosperity puts those achievements at risk. But humanistic learning is also an end in itself. It is simply better to have escaped one's narrow, petty self and entered minds far more subtle and vast than one's own than never to have done so. The Renaissance philosopher Marsilio Ficino said that a man lives as many millennia as are embraced by his knowledge of history. One could add, a man lives as many different lives as are embraced by his encounters with literature, music, and all the humanities and arts. These forms of expression allow us to see and feel things that we would otherwise never experience. Society on a 19th century Russian feudal estate, for example, or the perfect crystalline brooks and mossy shades of pastoral poetry, or the exquisite languor of a Chopin nocturne. These are 4 precious years to lose yourself in complexity, irony, and grandeur. 4 years to encounter history's greatest minds, grappling with mankind's greatest dilemmas. We should all be down on our knees in gratitude for the sublimity that has been bequeathed us. You'll get the most out of this great university if you reject the tribalism of identity politics and let yourselves roam free as individuals among ideas and eloquence. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much. The floor is open for questions.
Thank you. That was a great speech.
Thank you.
I love it. Should you suggest that tolerance in the university and on campus be extended to such ideas as communism, Nazism, and racial ideas? And if so, why?
Well, I think we need to understand those ideas. I don't know what tolerance means. I think knowledge is the solution to evil. I hope that rationality and rational discourse is the solution to oppression. So if something exists, communism exists, it should be understood and studied. So I'm not quite sure I understand the point of your question. But tolerance was one of the greatest discoveries of the Enlightenment. The idea that central authority should not dictate conscience, should not dictate religious belief, and that we were capable of working through our differences through language and rational debate. If you lose that, the alternative to discourse is force. I see no middle ground. Either you talk out your differences or you have force. And I fear that this country is slowly taking steps towards somehow a tolerance of the use of civil violence, something that the United States has had its outbreaks of throughout history for sure, but still nothing compared to other places on Earth today. And this is a precious advantage that we have to be very jealous of.
I have heard, I believe I read somewhere that number one, when they've given these courses or workshops in white privilege, that very often the result is the opposite, that is people become less tolerant
Right.
of people of other colors or whatever, and that also result is that those who are classed the oppressors, the white people, it harms their self-esteem, so they feel really bad. Is that, can you speak about that?
Well, frankly, I don't care about anybody's self-esteem particularly. I mean, we should all have a very strong dose of lack of confidence, I think, because none of us are come close to what we should be accomplishing. But I do find it odd the way our political discourse is currently constituted, where the charge is pervasive in the mainstream media that it is Trump and Trump alone which is engaging in divisive rhetoric or racially divisive rhetoric, when the assumption is that to talk about white privilege or toxic masculinity or white supremacy is not divisive rhetoric. That is assumed to be simply an empirical fact. But in fact, there is, I would say that the divisions based on identity are being promulgated with a lot of zeal on college campuses. And frankly, it's logically defensible that somebody's going to square the circle. And if you have identity politics based on minority status, you're going to get a white identity politics, if nothing else for a tit for tat. Now, I know the arguments, which is that there can be no such thing as racism or discrimination on the part of historically oppressed groups. And so there's simply by verbal fiat, by definitional fiat, the idea that a white could feel sort of at the mercy of identity politics is ruled out of order. But frankly, there will be a backlash because, you can't have only one side playing this game. That truce is not going to last.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I've been worried about this trend, this diversity ideology that you're describing, and I've noticed among academics there are quite a lot of people who are also worried about it, but they are quiet about it, and they convince themselves that the problem is cresting, and if we just keep our heads down, this will all go away. And part of it, I think, is since I think most professors are left-wing, if they identify politically at all, they just are not conditioned to see any sort of serious threat coming from the left. They're worried about racism.
That's true.
They are not conditioned to see like fanatical anti-racism as being a problem. They just are not able to perceive it, as far as I can tell. And some of the kind of like very far left rhetoric is so ridiculous that people aren't able to perceive it as being more than an annoyance, right? They don't see goose stepping, they see the ministry of silly walks. Like, this is not serious. But I try to get people to see, this actually is serious, right? If we're not able to talk about things, this is really a problem. So I'm wondering if your observations corroborate that and if you have any solutions to this problem.
Well, I think that's an astute analysis and one that I've sort of cloudily reached myself, which is the observation that what one group sees, the other side simply doesn't see, because they see it as normal and empirically valid, that yes, there is oppression on college campuses, so it's not as if that discourse is marked at all. It is seen as the central unmarked discourse. So, and there is, I do experience a odd kind of cognitive distance, well, that's not the right phrase, but impossible to bridge the divide when I read Chronicle of Education, Higher Education, and the more liberal faculty saying, this is simply not a problem. You know, there's no self-censorship going on campuses, and I think, where are you? Because I have not been to a campus where students will not tell me, and you can read, this is reported, it's not just me, there is a huge amount of self-censorship going on. The students who are not completely on board with the dominant ideology are terrified to speak up in class, and that's true of the faculty as well. They do keep their heads down. I'm sympathetic because it's one thing for me on the outside to be able to write criticism and I'm out of there. It's understandable. If you're in an institution, it takes a heck of a lot of courage to stand up against it. There was Donald Kagan at Yale, a great classicist historian of Thucydides, and he fought tooth and nail against the growing left-wing orthodoxies of Yale, but he was a unique man. I perceive this as a growing problem, not one that is diminishing. You know, you're not saying it is yourself, you're saying you're paraphrasing. I mean, there's no mainstream institution, none, zero, outside of academia now, that is not obsessed with diversity. Every day you could read up a new description. Recently there was a brouhaha over the fact that the elite New York law firm of Paul Weiss announced its latest partner class, and they were all white. And the assumption, not just in the legal community and the press, but Paul Weiss itself, is we must be discriminating. This is not true. Again, there's not a single law firm that is not trying to hire. In fact, elite law firms hire black associates at rates that are vastly larger than their proportion in the graduating class. But because of something that Richard Sander at UCLA has written about Stuart Taylor called mismatch, students aren't doing as well when they're brought in under racial preferences. The black associates are trit out. But everything you read from here on out, everything you watch, will have been created with gender quotas and race quotas in mind. Every publishing list, every publisher, that's how decisions are being made. And, you know, as I say, I don't think being female is particularly interesting, and I certainly do not think that I should ever have been chosen for anything to fill a gender quota, but thanks to the ubiquity of quotas, I have absolutely no confidence in any point in time that I'm not there so that we don't have a manel. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this now verboten institution of manels. A manel is a academic or any kind of panel consisting only of males. So if you are putting together a panel of the cutting-edge Alzheimer's researchers, the ones who have made the best contributions to trying to figure out what is it in our neurology that is leading to this terrifying, life-destroying disease. And it so happens that all of the cutting-edge top researchers are male. They don't have to be white. They could all be Asian. But you better not go forward with that mantle. And you better find a female to put on it. This is happening in academic conference after academic conference, whether it's in the sciences, in the classics, in history. Neil Ferguson at Stanford put together a conference on behavioral history, which is trying to be sort of a little bit more quantitative. And he did it quickly. He reached out to females, none accepted. So we ended up with an all-male panel. Stanford canceled it. They did not allow this academic gathering to go forward. So this thing is moving very, very quickly. We have California now, which is mandating gender representation on corporate boards. Even before that happened, I routinely voted against every female who showed up on a proxy ballot that I received, because I assume that there is a very great risk that she is there because of her gender, not her business expertise. I may be completely wrong. Maybe she is the top expert in investment banking, but let's note that Goldman Sachs recently put Drew Gilpin-Faust on its board. Goldman Sachs investment banking, Drew Gilpin-Faust, outgoing president of Harvard and a left-wing American history professor. Well, who knew that left-wing American history professors were experts in investment banking? But there she is on the board, and she is typical. Again, the problem with these preferences is there are individuals, many, who are perfectly capable of competing on their merits, but the stigma of a quota system affects everybody in the class, and so either as the recipient of the quota or as somebody dealing with somebody in the preferred class, you have no idea why they're there.
As a longtime student of modern history, it's easy to remark on the obvious drift toward totalitarianism in our society, particularly on the campuses. And I'm very concerned about this increasing imposition of any orthodoxy, but particularly this one, because it obviously has roots in Marxism. So I'm curious to hear you opine as to the genesis of this, who the major progenitors are, and what you would recommend to counteract it.
Well, I think I would actually, at this point, I would prefer an honest traditional Marxism, because I think it's more interesting. I think the categories, the Marxist categories of economic activity, at least have content to them. It's interesting if somebody's a capitalist or a railroad baron or a worker or proletarian. Those are categories with meaning. You've done something in your life. To me, gender and race and sexual orientation are very trivial, superficial categories. Identity politics is narcissistic in a way that Marxism was not, and it is of the most evanescent meaning. I see, for me, the roots of our culture today stems in part from the wild successes of capitalism that produced so much wealth, so much surplus wealth, that adolescents, teenagers, for the first time in history, had independent spending power from their parents. And so you had corporations targeting children who are ignorant for an entire sort of culture. And this gave children, adolescents, teenagers, power. And because when you have them as the target of corporate seduction, they can also turn their backs on it. So they become competing consumers in society. That started to break down parental authority. Adolescents became more and more empowered and independent. The car obviously helped as well. And that gave rise in the 60s to the whole glorification of student protest and this idea that students know something that we should listen to. Now, students, every so often, they're right, like the broken clock. I would say the students in Tiananmen Square, they were right about their society. But I do not know why I should listen to a 16 or 17 or 18-year-old tell me about the evils of capitalism, who has never tried to run an enterprise and master supply chains and demand, and tried to manage a group of people. These are people with no experience of the world, and yet we're in a world upside down situation, as the medievalists in the room will recognize, where youth are taken as somehow paragons of wisdom. And so that then gave rise to the belief that America is uniquely evil because these students know nothing about world history or comparative politics of the moment. And we started gradually to get these narcissistic studies coming into place. What can be done about it? Well, I'm sorry to say this at a university, but alumni, please do not give another damn cent to your school unless you're confident that it's going to something like the Center for Western Civilization or something that is preserving our inheritance. This is the essence of education. It is passing down an inheritance from one generation to the next. It is not about destroying that inheritance, and that's what's becoming. The other thing that needs to happen is people need to screw up the courage and say that racism and sexism are not the predominant characteristics of American society today. The Diversity Delusion, frankly, the title of the book was not mine. It was the publisher's. But then, of course, you have to say, okay, what is the diversity delusion? Well, I didn't come up with it, but in preparation for book interviews, you sort of have to have an answer to that. And so I thought about what it is. And the answer that I've come up with is it consists of at least 3 propositions. One, race and gender, sexual preference, you name it, 116 now gender identities and growing quickly. It's like the debt clock in Times Square. How many are we up to now, gender identities? It's probably 200. But that those are the most important aspects of an individual, that discrimination based on those characteristics is the predominant and historical and eternal definition of American society. And 3, this is most crucial, any lack of proportional representation in any institution, any lack of 50-50 male-female representation, or any lack of proportional representation among various minority ethnic groups is by definition a result of discrimination and bigotry. And the solution, therefore, is diversity hiring and quota hiring. And I would just say, when it comes to the STEM fields, that is just not the case. It is, if we engineer a 50-50 gender parity in STEM, we are going to be getting rid of a whole lot of groundbreaking scientists, because on average, again, I'm not talking about any of your daughters in this room. They are individuals, and they could all be on their way to the next Nobel Prize in chemistry, for all I know. I am speaking here only about averages. On average, males gravitate towards more abstract, ideas-based work, females towards more hands-on, relational, human-based work that changes the world for the better. It's the guys that are in the computer science lab at 2 a.m. with the cold pizza husks, coding. There's females that do that, but again, we're talking about averages. Psychology, which is not exactly a conservative field, for decades has talked about the big 5 personality traits. This has been replicated again and again. One of the things that the poor ingenue James Damore wrote in his infamous 10-page memo at Google before being fired, he talked about females as being more neurotic. Now, this struck the lay ear as really offensive, but he didn't explain neuroticism is one of the big 5 personality traits. And it turns out that females, on average, again, no female in this room, no daughter in this room, no mother in this room, but averages, distributions, okay? On average, males are more risk-taking, females more risk-averse. Female economists have shown males are more competitive, they're more driven. I've been collecting, so again, if you are going to say that the only possible reason for a lack of 50-50 parity in a physics department or a math department is discrimination and bias, you're saying, first of all, that those faculty are so benighted that they would rather not hire the most qualified mathematician or physicist who would increase their rankings, which every department lives for. You want to get the most hot STEM practitioner out there to compete against Cornell and MIT. So we're supposed to believe that these engineers are so benighted that they'll turn away from a female who's the most qualified simply because they cannot see female talent. This is absurd. But I've been collecting natural experiments that test the diversity delusion hypothesis. The diversity delusion hypothesis says it's sexist gatekeepers that are responsible for the lack of 50-50 gender parity in any institution. And note as well, nobody complains about the fact that 83% of OBGYN residents are female. Nobody complains about the fact that the majority of college students are female. Nobody complains about the fact that the majority of professors in many, many fields are female, and administrators. So we don't care about males being underrepresented. That's never a result of male bias. But any underrepresented temptation of females is by definition anti-female bias. But there are some interesting institutions out there that have no gatekeepers. And they provide a natural experiment in the diversity delusion hypothesis. So something like Wikipedia, which you may know, which is the free online encyclopedia that is crowdsourced. Anybody can contribute to Wikipedia. They can write the entry. They can edit the entry. It's blind. Nobody knows the identity of the contributors. So it's a free-for-all. The percentage of female Wikipedia editors and writers is 13%. There are no gatekeepers. Any female on the planet can participate in Wikipedia. It turns out that on average, that drive to nail down facts in an obsessive, compulsive manner. We all know the autistic geeks out there, the weirdos. That is more found in males and females. Again, there's lots of female counter examples to the rule, but we're talking averages. There's plenty of other interesting ones I've been collecting. Scrabble championships. The majority of amateur Scrabble players is female by a long shot. There has never been a female world champion Scrabble player. Again, that obsessive drive to memorize entire dictionaries tends to be something that, for whatever bizarre reason, males do more often. His history bees, the high school history bees, females do better on AP history. And yet, in this stratified realm of competition, of driven, it's all male. It's very curious. It's very curious. And the most taboo thing to say when we're talking about STEM, when we're talking about math, the thing that got Larry Summers fired from the presidency of Harvard University, is he got into the highly dangerous, off-limits realm of variance in math abilities. If you want to talk math dummies, if you want to talk people that still haven't gotten the hang of 2 + 1, you're talking males. They're clueless. when it comes to with the most incompetent at math. They leave females in the dust. But if you want to talk about the very highest realm of pushing the boundaries, in the United States, for every 2.5 males at the 0.01% of math capacity, you've got one female. This is variance. The other thing that matters is that males who are very good at math tend to be really poor in verbal skills. Females that are very good in math also have strong verbal skills. So they have more options. There's something known as the gender paradox. The countries that rate highest on the gender equity scale, Norway, Sweden, where there's practically, it's ridiculous to say there's sexism there. They have the least female involvement in STEM because there's so many options. So anyway, I'm going off, but we've got to fight. As long as the narrative dominates that the only explanation for lack of proportional representation is bias, the left wins. So we have to fight back against that.
Okay, I see a bunch of hands. I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. We've got time for questions, so hang in there. That's good. That's what I'm first.
Thank you. William Allen.
Thank you. Hi.
I appreciate the account you've given
Thank you.
of the ills that are fostered by the merchants of diversity. And it seems to be fairly widespread, sufficiently so that I'm prepared to make the assumption that you would not argue that the ill are the designs or consequences they produce are the result of evil purposes. If that assumption is correct, then that would mean that they are seriously misguided in the pursuit of something benign, if not beneficent. And so I wonder if you are willing to try your hand at offering them some advice, if you can identify any potential benign or beneficent purposes, if you would try your hand at giving them advice on how they might pursue those and cause less damage in the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Professor Allen. I would say that, for one thing, we have to start earlier. When it comes to the issue of diversity, when it comes to race, there's just this bizarre disconnect in the mainstream academic discourse, where every diversity program says, my God, we don't have proportional representation. We must be racist. We must be racist. Well, name some names, please. Who's discriminating against the competitively qualified black engineer? I don't know of anybody. But it turns out that in 2016, in the entire country, there were 6 black PhDs that graduated in computer engineering, meaning it is mathematically impossible for every computer engineering department in the country to have a proportional representation of blacks. In computer science, I think there were 3. And there are many fields that are graduating no blacks at all. We have here, what's going on is a skills gap that has persisted now for decades. It's a standard deviation in SAT scores. Your average black 12th grader reads at the level of your average white 8th grader. Given that it is unrealistic to expect proportional representation, and it is also deeply misleading. So I think the focus has to be on building the pipeline. We're doing this so late. And the message that we're sending, I would say, in invoking phantom racism as the reason for lack of proportional representation, I would say makes the problem worse. You are telling minority students on campuses to imagine themselves surrounded by microaggressions and bias. And that doesn't do anybody any good. I think because again, this may be insulting to you, but I'm going to say, I don't believe there are bigots at the University of Colorado Boulder. Excuse me if that's a negative thing to say, but I just don't believe it. I believe that every faculty member here is open-minded and supports students. This last week, I was at the University of Pennsylvania, as a matter of fact. A student claimed that his professor had failed him when he learned that he was gay. It's just lunatic, okay? Lunatic. But he has been led to come up with those types of explanations. How about your paper wasn't very good? So I think that when it comes to the racial diversity issue, again, it's a hard thing it's a very painful thing to talk about. But there's got to be some cultural changes, some behavioral changes. There's certain types of schools that I think have the best chance of success. But we have to stop turning our eyes away from the problem that is creating this lack of diversity and be honest about why it's there.
Hi. I want to start by saying that I'm generally sympathetic to your argument, but I feel like I need to speak for the younger generation because if we're going to be honest, on average, I'm going to have to live with this a lot longer than most of you. I don't. I guess I've been thinking about this for a while, and a couple things strike me about your argument. You're trying to combat people's subjective truths with objective facts, and it's a system or a method of reasoning which is itself a legacy of Western civilization and our way of thinking about things. But it's really, really hard to do that without degenerating effectively into white victimhood.
Into what?
It's
white victimhood?
Yeah, this is what you said earlier in response to a comment here, that there's going to be a response and a reaction to this, and it's going to be kind of a one-for-one response. I'm already hearing it from you, to be completely honest, as someone that actually agrees with you, objectively speaking. And I just wonder do you have a better way of framing this, or flipping the narrative somehow? Because it's kind of a conundrum to me. Like, you're never going to succeed, because no matter how many statistics you throw at people, you can't beat their subjective feelings over the head with numbers. Our minds don't work that way.
Well, you've made two statements. One is, a question about rhetorical strategies, and that I'm a little puzzled by your claim that what I'm talking about is white victimhood. I'm not. What I'm talking about is, again, the fact that we should be down on our knees before this extraordinary civilization, and that no student should be taught to hate. And I could go on quoting the rhetoric that I've heard from students in colleges across the country at being asked to read Plato or Aristotle or Kant or Wordsworth or Milton. It's shocking. So I don't see that as white victimhood. But your question about whether it's futile to try and combat arguments from feelings with reason, it's a question. And part of me wants to say, sorry, we've got to keep trying. And I guess I tend to be sort of one that is more oriented towards facts. So I'm trying to imagine just what a sample of the type of argument that you're suggesting would be more effective. I don't know if it's enough to have sort of CYA statements of, well, I understand that you feel victimized here or threatened at the University of Boulder, University of Colorado Boulder, but maybe there's other opportunities that you're not really seizing upon. I guess I would, because I view those feelings as so very far from reality. I really do. Maybe I'm just being overly simplistic here, but I can tell you again, why does the world want to come to the United States or the West? Why? And good luck holding a gay pride parade in many parts of the world. Good luck being a strong, empowered female in many parts of the world. Again, any college student is just the luckiest person on earth. And so any argument or effort at reaching somebody subjectively that concedes to that fundamental misprision of reality, it would be a hard thing for me to do. But I would welcome a sample piece of oratory that you think would be more successful. But it would stick in my throat. I'm gonna tell you that honestly.
Hello, it's nice to see you again.
Hi.
So I'm having a hard time with your argument as well, and I think maybe there is a little bit of a generation thing. From my experience in CU, there's not even I don't even think there's 5% black students at this campus, and I think there is something to be said about how successful we can be in a community where we're surrounded by people like ourselves. Last semester, or last spring, when I was with the center, I had actually approached our visiting scholar Robert Kaufman to help me with an independent research study on studying women in national security. And I got a letter back from the International Affairs Department, anonymous, saying, basically, absolutely not right. You're not this isn't really worth our time. Plus, I have a hard time understanding why there would be a difference between men and women in national security. And I brought that to Professor Kaufman, and he's like, roll your eyes, don't worry too much about it. It's okay that the department doesn't see that as that way. But I guess I kept thinking, well, maybe if the department had more females in that role, there wouldn't be someone telling me on behalf of the department that women and men don't have very different roles, because they clearly have very different roles in national security. And I'm thinking, if there are more people in the administration who, like our new visiting conservative scholar, who had a different perspective, it's not necessarily about qualifications. It's simply, when I go to something, I want to see someone who might have had the similar experience as me, and that's really it. And it's not about, maybe this person's more qualified or is better academics, but it's simply about, in this day and age, especially as America is becoming less and less white, it is very, very important for someone like myself to see someone like myself in roles that I cannot imagine myself in. And I guess I'm having a hard time understanding what really the threat is of having, perhaps maybe you're not the most qualified, but it's about someone looking up to you and saying, you know what, they may not be the smartest person or the most qualified person on the panel, but they're invited to the panel. And I don't see really what the threat is, and I'm hoping you can maybe explain why so vigorously some members in this room see that as a threat or harm.
Well, because I don't know what a person like yourself is. I'm not going to assume by your race or gender what you are. I know conservative whites and liberal blacks. I know liberal whites and conservative blacks. I simply am not going to typecast like that. And I guess I do strive for an ideal that there is a realm of reason and fact that we can reach that is not dependent on something that I think is ultimately superficial, which is skin color and gender. And as for the role model argument, that's a very familiar one and one that is often made. If that's a real argument, then you can never change anything. There's always got to be a pioneer. And if you can only go where somebody so-called like you, and again, there's many ways of defining what's like me. I mean, again, 50 years ago, like me might have been a banker or a railroad worker. Those were the categories. They were economic ones. They were not identity categories. So this is something very new in human thought, to see these as the driving forces in history. But how did Marie Curie discover radium? There were no females before. What's wrong with being a pioneer? I revered my professors in college. Some of them I regard now as misguided in the things I studied, which we were talking about at lunch, literary theory, deconstruction, and post-structuralism, and Jacques Derrida, and mythologie blanche, and but they stood for me as people with wisdom, with a knowledge that I yearned for. And it made no difference to me whether they were male or female. It turns out most of them were male. My major English poets professor in freshman year was a female. She was wonderful, but it never occurred to me to think, well, I can learn best from females. Why this matters, I would say in the sciences, it definitely matters. I think in the sciences, there are pretty objective criteria of expertise. And somebody I know who's an oncologist at an Ivy League medical school was berated by his dean for giving an exam in pharmacology that was too, quote, fact-based. Being fact-based these days is one of the no-no pedagogies that are seen as not inclusive enough. Well, if I have cancer, I don't know about you, I want my doctor to know the facts about drug interactions. And when we start putting diversity ahead of the pure development of scientific knowledge, I think we're putting ourselves at risk. A astrophysicist at a University of California school has reported, and I've since observed this is true, science education across the country is being slowed down and watered down because of the demands of diversity. China is not doing this. You can see the ranked universities, China is gradually catching up. They are taking their scientists back. They still are sending them here to be educated, where they face quotas. You know, there's no question there are anti-Asian quotas at every selective school in the country, because without those, it would be we would have at least plurality Asian populations, if not vast majorities. And they are putting, their only thing they care about is who's the most qualified. If a lab is all female and they're the most qualified, so be it, great. But I do not care about the race and gender of the people who are going to cure Alzheimer's.
Okay, I realize we're running out of time here, but I do want to try to take just a few more questions. Can I just see how many people out there would still like to ask a question, just to get a sense of the scope of things? So
I'll be faster.
So let's see if we can take these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions, okay? And then we will have some food.
Hi, thank you for your talk.
Thank you.
I was a lecturer here not too long ago, and I was teaching a course in American political thought. And I thought I was trying to give a kind of a balanced good and evil picture of some of the revered figures in American history. And what I discovered, it was largely sophomores. What I discovered was that the majority of my students, and especially the ones who were willing to speak up, would, if I said, wasn't it better that George Washington freed his slaves in his will than if he had passed them on to his heirs? They would say no. They were Manichees, so they had a really sharp good and evil distinction. And George Washington had fallen into just the pure evil category. There was nothing good, therefore, to be learned from him. Thomas Jefferson was the same. And I was willing to say, hey, there's a lot of evil here. I'm willing to look at that openly and describe it and say, yeah, I see it. But isn't there some good? And they were like, nope, nope, nope. It's just evil. And this must have been put into their thinking long before they got to university.
You're right.
Long before. And so my question is, what is it in the education or the general culture that's turned us into so many Manichees?
Well, it's a very weird thing for a civilization to turn on itself the way we have. The only remote, parallel that I can think of is the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and I don't know what happens to a civilization if it is unwilling to celebrate what is great in itself. I don't know how a civilization continues, but there's no question that the mainstream elite culture today is involved in a sort of compulsive, it's like Lady Macbeth washing her hands all the time. It's just extraordinary. The search for racism where it does not necessarily exist. It is the national religion now.
Okay. I think you were one of my people. Yes.
My question, I was curious if you think that cognitive scientists or cognitive science blends into the things that you're talking about. And sort of as a background, that cognitive science would suggest that humans are really much more emotional than they are rational. And therefore, a simple narrative cohesion is easier to sort of deal with, whether it's behavioral economics, the biology of morality, the biology of violence, the knowledge illusion by a professor here. That people just want to have a real simple solution and not really sort of think about it, that they want to live in their limbic system and not use their prefrontal cortex.
Mm-hmm. Well, that could well be, and in which case, I don't know where that leaves us. It's a council of, if it's true, we've got to face up to the truth, and it probably is. And everybody, I mean, we all have our blinders, I have our blinders, and I would say that generally, the difference between, say, liberals and conservatives are that liberals see structural forces at work in outcomes, socioeconomic disparities. They'll take structural explanations. Conservatives tend to see individual choices. And both are probably blind to the other side. There's probably structural problems that conservatives underestimate. And I would say, from my perspective, the progressive view is very blind to the behavioral choices that I think are the predominant drivers of inequality today. So how you get over those cognitive blinders is a tough thing. But all I can say is we've got to keep arguing. When we stop arguing and start resorting to brute force, then we're really in trouble.
Okay, hopefully there are 3 more. So 1, 2, and 3. Good.
I just want to thank you. It was a great talk.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. One of the data points that you mentioned is something that has always left me with this mystery, and that is when you mentioned that before you get to university, the data for reading comprehension among African Americans is at the 8th grade level of Anglo-Americans. And I don't understand why there is this affirmative action quota approach at the university level, as if you can skip over that predicament that began sometime earlier. What do you think is the explanation why something so obvious that we're just going to, give everybody prizes, doesn't get addressed at the high school level or at the grammar school level, where really, if they don't get it there, the idea that they can sort of leapfrog into the university,
right,
and because of the academic atmosphere, compete equally with people who did get it.
Right. That's the mismatch problem. I know. As far as like Colorado, the population in Colorado, I just looked it up before I came. the College Board, which administers the SATs, they have something called a benchmark score, which is the minimal grade on your math and English SATs that will give you a 75% chance of getting a C in your freshman classes, and it's very low. I mean, the benchmark for English SATs is like 470. The benchmark for math is about 520 or 30. In Colorado, 81% of white and Asian SAT takers met both benchmarks, but only 42% of blacks met both, and 26% of blacks met none, compared to 5% and 4% of whites and Asians. So if we wonder why there isn't more black faces at University of Colorado Boulder, that is why. Believe me, no admissions officer is discriminating against black applicants. This is, again, I just think that our culture is turning our eyes away from this because it's not changing, and nobody wants to say that there's certain cultural habits that are best exemplified by the Asian tiger mom that everybody should adopt, and that it starts in the home, it starts in a fanatical attention to going to school. In California, blacks have a truancy rate that is 5 times higher than the rest of the state. You can't learn if you're not in school. And parents do have a responsibility. You know, Kamala Harris got in trouble because she wanted to have some mechanism for holding parents liable for not sending their kids to school. There are a whole set of factors, two-parent families, but above all, we've got to demolish the anti-acting white ethos. And my God, Orlando Patterson has written about this. The diversity commissars at UCLA have written an entire study of the lack of diversity in STEM. They talk about the anti-acting white ethos that exists even at UCLA. So I would say there's a whole set of choices that need to change. And people feel, I think partly because of our history, the asking for personal responsibility seems unfair.
Yeah, I've got a question. If you want college students to come to the table and act in a way that they don't perceive themselves through a filter of discrimination, let's say that they do that, right? But what happens if they do come to the table and become discriminated against? Is it the student's job to not perceive themselves the way they've been treated? Or how do we address the person that's creating the problem? And how do we address that?
So I would first like to name a name of somebody who's discriminated against. I would just like to see an example of that. If you've been discriminated against. On what basis?
My significant other is African American. My child is biracial.
And your professors have discriminated against you for that reason?
You said that you don't believe there's been discrimination in Boulder. You've made the sweeping statement that you do not believe that, but there are facts.
Okay, I was referring to the university. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. What? That there's faculty here that are discriminating? Yes. Who? I'm not going to name names. Well, have you brought it up with them?
Yes.
And
to make your sweeping comments is so irresponsible. It is not true to say that there are no faculty member on this campus who is bigoted. You cannot do that. That is irresponsible.
Well,
I have been on this campus 21 of the past 31 years. I came here from high school as an undergrad, and I experienced these things. So you are denying my experience and the experience of many of the students here?
Well, again, here we have an experience issue. With my knowledge of academia generally, which is not the same as your involvement in Boulder, University of Colorado, I think that faculty members are the most liberal group in human history, and I think that they are hoping for everyone to succeed. Sometimes people perceive discrimination where it exists. Other times they perceive discrimination where it doesn't exist. I think there have been lawsuits filed, discrimination lawsuits, where people say I was discriminated against, where the fact of the matter is you were not the best, and I'm using you not personally, of course, I don't want you to think that, you weren't the best candidate. But now we have a ready-to-hand explanation for certain groups that it must have been discrimination. And I just, again, I assume then you've taken this up with the individuals involved and it has been adjudicated, but I do start with the presumption that this is a community that is driven by the desire to be as inclusive as possible, like most colleges today.
Okay, there's one final question somewhere in here. Yes.
Thanks for your clarity on this. I really appreciate it. Do you have any thoughts on what are the psychological underpinnings of what I see as the guilt what are the psychological underpinnings of this kind of thinking, focusing on identity rather than qualifications?
That's a tough question. It's a return of a tribal identity, of group identity, and I mean, we are in a world now that celebrates the victim, and I wonder about where did that come from. Nietzsche noticed that Christianity was a subversion of the classical virtues, which celebrated strength and heroism to a fault. You know, I don't particularly enjoy reading the Aeneid because of all of, or the Iliad because of all the warfare. You know, but for most of human history, the thing that people do and still do in many other cultures is make war, and the main criterion of success is conquest. The Greeks certainly celebrated strength. Christianity, for better or worse, most people would say for better, said no, there is value in being the victim. Christ is the victim par excellence. And whether that is sort of the very minute seeds of what is happening now with this strange, I mean, again, it is hard to follow the latest permutations in who gets to be top dog victim these days. The whole intersectionality concept. Right now, trans seems to be on top. It's trumping everything else. It's trumping being gay, it's trumping being female, it's trumping being black. But something is going to come along in the next couple of years, I can guarantee you, that will knock that down. But the claim is that that's what intersectionality is. Can you check enough boxes to be the top dog victim? And why we've gone that direction to celebrate the people who purport to be the most oppressed by us is curious. And by say us, I just mean the culture at large. I mean, every institution is doing its hand washing. It's a very bizarre thing.
Okay, let's thank
Thank you.